Hi everyone, welcome back. So we're now officially in week 2, and hopefully everything went well for you guys during week 1. Do you have any suggestions, feedback on how do you like the structure of the class? Any way we could possibly be better in terms of helping you guys, making it a little bit easier for y'all, please don't hesitate to let us know. Okay, so today and for the rest of the week, we're going to be covering some cool extensions from behavior analysis. So we have been learning all about these principles, right? And so these principles are going to set us up to really start to tackle and understand those big picture, what's going on out there, kinds of topics that we were all kind of interested in and diving into at the beginning of the class. So before I said we could start understanding those, we needed a framework in which to ask questions in a way that we can start actually finding some answers. And so today we're going to be talking about some of those extensions and how other people have done that kind of research. So today, again, this is kind of like some overarching topics we're going to be talking about. We're talking a little bit about punishment, escape and avoidance, coercion, and alternative approaches. So first, remember, punishment is a principle of behavior, and basically what we're saying is that when a consequence follows a behavior, if the consequence decreases over time, we talk about punishment, right? And there are multiple types of punishments. These punishments also have antecedents, right? So we talked a lot about SDs as deltas. Well, whenever you have a history of punishment, instead of producing an SD, it produces an SAV, or a stimulus or an aversive stimulus, or an SP, a stimulus that's been correlated with punishment. And over time, because of that history with that aversive stimulus, a stimulus then becomes an SDP, a stimulus that is discriminative for a punishment contingency. And then there's two types of punishment, right? So we have positive punishment, where there is something added to the environment, and we also have negative punishment, where something is removed from the environment and behavior decreases as a result. So let's just quickly go over some examples, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So I told Thomas, we were hanging out, and one of my favorite actors, I think he is a phenomenal actor, it's Christopher Waltz. Then I told Thomas, and because him and Grandpa often talk about movies and how cool they are, I'm kind of lame and don't really watch movies. So I told Thomas, hey, this guy's awesome. And then Thomas, just being smart, just said, you haven't watched enough movies to say he's a good actor. And I was like, dang, okay, so that means I'm not going to talk about movies anymore, right? So in fact, he punished my behavior of talking about movies with them.
Yeah, and in this case, this really did happen. And it's not that Will just stopped talking about movies in general. He stopped talking about movies around Thomas. He still talks about movies around me or other people, but it's essentially Thomas became that SDP for talking about movies.
Great add-on. So now let's move on to the next one. So a child loses a portion of their allowance each time that they say a bad word. They stop saying this word. What kind of punishment is this? This would be an example of negative punishment, right? Because there's a behavior, saying a bad word, and every time that behavior happens, something is removed from the environment. In this case, it'd be a portion of their allowance. So then another example of punishment would be each time a worker finishes a report, their boss says, wow, you did an outstanding job. The worker doesn't finish their reports anymore. Basically here, what we're trying to draw the contrast to is that it doesn't matter if your intention is to punish a behavior if the behavior doesn't change, right? The way that we define the principles of behavior is by observing changes in behavior. If the behavior doesn't change, so let's say in this case, if it doesn't decrease, it's not a punishment. And if the behavior increases, that means it's a reinforcer, right? Cool. So some things to keep in mind. With punishment, there are always some side effects. One, it can affect the relationship between organisms. So if I'm always talking mess to this guy, I'm probably not going to be SD anymore for approach. I'm probably going to become an aversive stimulus or an SDP. So he might be likely to run away. So if I am in the environment after just continually punishing all his behaviors, he may no longer want to be anywhere near me. He might completely avoid me, or he might try to actually get even, right? He might try to start talking mess to me. And those are all side effects that punishment can produce. But if we think about it, punishment does have a role, right? Imagine living in a world where your behavior isn't punished, right? So if you come into contact with something that can physically harm you, and you're not stopping and your behavior toward that thing doesn't decrease, that might be evolutionarily unadaptive, right? Because I would keep going to the poison ivy even though I know it's going to mess me up. So there might be some kind of evolutionary advantages to it. And again, kind of ties back to it probably helped our species survive for so long, right? So imagine jumping off of high places. Do you think I would have much success doing that with my fragile human body? Do you think
Very fresh.
do you think that certain animals would be as effective as they are if they continually if they don't learn what hasn't worked for them in the past? Eating poisonous plants, right? Poison ivy will mess me up, and if I keep eating it, I'll probably die. Another side effect to keep in mind is that punishment can be reinforcing to the person applying it. So let's say that I'm a boss at a factory, right? And he's my employee. If I use punishment and it works, right? I tell him, hey, Carlos, stop being so lame. I need you to finish this product by Monday. And he actually meets the deadline. What does that mean? My application of a punishment procedure may function as a reinforcer because next time that I want him to change his behavior, I'll resort to punishment. So this is something we call the punishment trap. And it could lead people to only use punishment because it's the only thing that has worked for them in the past because they haven't looked at those possible more constructional alternatives to build behavior.
Yeah, and usually you always see punishment procedures used a lot in our society because they're effective, right? That's something compared to reinforcement. It's effective immediately, and you don't have to find other ways of getting that same behavior, right? Because although reinforcement is a better way to go about changing behavior, it does take a little bit longer than punishment procedures.
Exactly. So now, remember, just because you think something should be reinforcing or punishing doesn't mean that it is, right? Because the way we, again, define these terms is functionally. How do these consequences have an effect on the environment? Do we see that change? If we don't see that change, it's not going to be something you can label as a reinforcer or punisher. So some examples, right? Timeout. It's frequently used with kids all the time, but let's say put a kid in timeout and he's still frequently engaging in the behavior of cursing. Is that an effective punisher? No, it's not a punisher at all, right? Because the behavior hasn't changed. So some all other considerations to keep in mind is that sometimes whenever you use punishment, it can lead to an increase in the behavior that has been previously paired with. So what do we mean by that, Carlos?
Yeah, so what this means is kind of like what Will was saying, right? Only because you think something's going to be a punisher doesn't mean it's going to be a punisher functionally, right? So let's say, for example, we have you have a kid that gets a timeout and is sent to their room. Let's say you have a child and you want him to stop engaging in maybe hitting his sister or hitting his brother. So what you do is then you say, hey, I want you to stop doing that. And the way you want to go about doing that is giving him a timeout by sending him to his room for like 20 minutes. Usually what's in their room is a lot of toys, right? So essentially you think that the timeout is going to serve as a punisher to decrease the behavior, but what you're really actually doing is giving them access to reinforcers. So now he's probably going to be engaging in those behaviors a lot more just to get access to those reinforcers that you gave them in the first place. So that's why you got to be really careful about what procedures you're using, and you also always have to do what Will says, was check that behavior afterwards, right? If it doesn't decrease, it's not functioning as a punisher. If you see an increase in that behavior, you're giving them access to reinforcers that you probably didn't even think about.
Exactly. So now we're going to be talking about two of the most common effects that are associated with punishment, right? So we have escape and avoidance. So basically, what escape means is when a response terminates an ongoing aversive stimulus, right? So imagine, right now I have my hand on a fire, right? Right now he's burning me. Then what am I going to do? I'm going to withdraw my hand as fast as I can, right? So what we're saying is with escape, you have an active aversive stimulus present. So in this case, my thumb is the fire. Then my behavior of removing it is escaping that aversive stimulation, okay? Things to consider: organism is currently experiencing the punisher, and escape response stops the punisher from continuing. So an easy way to remember this that I grabbed from Urban Dictionary, because I thought it actually fit these examples perfectly, is the concept of boy by. According to Urban Dictionary, it means to go ahead with yourself and get out of someone's face, right? So if somebody is being really aversive to you, again, let's say I'm talking less to Carlos, he's going to be like, screw you, guy, and he's going to leave, right? So in essence, he is engaging in behaviors to escape the aversive stimulation, which is me talking shit to him. So again, talking trash. And then this used to be an in-class exercise, but I'll let you guys think of some other examples of when you engage in escape behaviors. So another one is avoidance, right? So after having that history where, we have a fire, my hand, every time I touch it, it burns, right? Which reinforces my behavior of escaping the aversive stimulation. So what do you think is going to happen? So now there's an aversive stimulus present. So again, there's a fire. Am I going to be likely to keep trying to touch it? No, eventually I'm going to stop and I'm going to engage in responses that are either going to prevent the aversive stimulation. So I'm either going to walk around the fire or I'm going to wear a glove, right? That's going to delay the time between me actually feeling the fire and getting burned, right? So all of these are behaviors that I am engaging in to try to prevent, cancel, or delay the aversive stimulation. So important contrast to the escape is that I'm not experiencing the fire, right? So again, back to that talking trash example, talking mess to Carlos over a long period of time, eventually he's gonna get sick of me. He's not even gonna be around me. He's gonna see me down the hall, be like, man, that guy's a jerk, go the other way, right? That is what an avoidance response looks like. So it keeps the punisher from happening. A good way to remember this one is this Urban Dictionary word swerve, right? So what do you do when you're in a predicament when something bad's going to happen, right? You're going to swerve, go to the side, completely avoid the situation altogether, right? So that, and there, sorry for that typo. It says escape, but this is really avoidance. So in case you have an expired registration sticker, this is actually a real life example because I know a certain someone that had an expired sticker for like 5 months or something.
6 months.
And this individual got really, really good at avoiding police officers so they wouldn't get pulled over and be given a ticket, right? So they never actually got the ticket, but they engaged in behaviors to to avoid that aversive stimulation altogether. So let's say that my apartment just randomly catches on fire. What do we do, right? So first, the fire is in the room. Is the stimulation present or am I avoiding it? It's present, right? So now we're going to engage in escape response. We're probably going to break the window or go through the door, right? Try to escape this aversive situation because we don't want to be burned. But what if someone's outside? Do you think they would try to come inside the apartment without knowing that there's people in here? Probably not, right? They'd be like, oh, good thing that apartment's empty. So they'll just completely avoid the situation altogether, right? Never coming into contact with that aversive stimulation of the fire. And remember, important to keep in mind, the reason people avoid is not because of some kind of a inner drive to escape danger. It's because they've learned that, there is aversive stimulation that's going to happen when you touch fire. So over a history of reinforcement, you kind of develop that history of reinforcement to avoid, right? It's negatively reinforcing to avoid fire. So the one on the left is escape, and the one on the right is avoidance. So now, let's say
Those are some good movies.
that we go to a party, okay? So me and Carlos go to a party, and then I see my ex-girlfriend. Okay, that's awkward, right? We've all kind of experienced that situation. Me personally, I would not want to be in that environment, right? That's awkward, it's weird. It doesn't have to be, but for me, it generally is. So I'm just going to want to get out of that party. Like, I don't care that people are having fun. They could continue having fun. I'm going to go do my own thing, right? That's escape because my girlfriend's presence was an aversive stimulus. I just wanted to leave. However, let's say that Carlos told me, hey, dude, let's go to a party. We're still at home. And he tells me that my ex-girlfriend's going to be there. So I haven't seen her yet. But he says, hey, dude, she's going to be there. I'm like, you know what, dude? Go for it. I'm good. I'm going to play video games at home, right? That would be an example of avoidance. So let's talk about something else. What's happening in this picture? This guy looks like he's real fun to hang out with, right? So what exactly is coercion? So coercion is controlling people's behavior through the use of punishment, the threat of punishment, or the removal of punishment. And I'm sure you can see this happening a lot in the world of work and business, right? Whenever we think about the archetype boss, right, it's generally a very aggressive person that is using punishment to try to push their employees to meet deadlines. And that is never a really beloved character, right? It's somebody we always want to avoid. So this is exactly what we talk about by coercion. It's using these procedures, punishment, threat of punishment, removal of punishment, to change behavior. And really, what we're talking about is the types of contingencies that are being put out to the organisms, right? So if I am consistently using punishment to change his behavior, then I am utilizing coercion. And coercion doesn't just have to be punishment, it can also be negative reinforcement, right? Because how do we define negative reinforcement? It's kind of like avoidance. Actually, it is avoidance. So there is an aversive stimulus that my behavior increases of escaping or avoiding his presence, right? So I'm more likely to engage in behaviors that have resulted in escaping or avoiding him in the past. So why do people use coercion? Generally, it's because it improves behavior, exactly as Carlos said earlier. But you got to keep in mind that it does change behavior, but you always got to consider those side effects, right? It's going to lead people to escape, avoid, or try to get even with you. So what can be done, right? Again, the punishment trap is a really, really important idea. The more you use punishment and the more it works, the more likely you're to continue to do this, right? So just like we always talk about, that boss, the archetype boss that uses force to try to get people to change their behavior. It's not because he's evil or mean or a terrible person. It's because he got stuck in this punishment trap, right? So anytime he used the punishment procedure, people did what he wanted. If they spoke nicely and with reason, in certain circumstances, people would probably ignore him. So that's how you get caught up in this trap and then just stick to coercion.
Yeah, one thing to consider in that example is that maybe the boss is also being coerced to use those kind of contingencies with his or her employee, right? Because he or she has to answer to someone else, and they might be using coercion, punishment. Maybe they have to meet a certain number, so the only way they could reach those numbers is through punishment or coercion.
Exactly. So what can we do instead of resorting to aversive control or coercion? Some things we can do. With aversive control, you generally are going to feel like you're stuck, trapped, or unhappy. So if you ever kind of feel like this, it might mean that currently in your environment, there's some aversive contingencies that are operating. So one thing you can try to do is try to figure out what those aversive contingencies are and try to use alternatives to coercion to try to fix that. So these emotions, they can be a byproduct of those aversive contingencies. And instead of using that, you can use more constructive methods of contingency management to alleviate those adverse effects. So we're going to talk a little bit about them. So instead of using coercion, you can use positive reinforcement, right? Present a stimulus following a behavior that increases behavior over time, generally for appropriate behavior. Differential reinforcement, right? Just like we talked about last week, right? You want to reinforce appropriate topographies that are going to increase that behavior, and you want to place the inappropriate behavior on extinction. Examples, right? Instead of listening to people when they yell, you respond when they ask nicely. Chaining and shaping, right? So basically here, what you're doing is you're going to build and teach them how to engage in the desired response if they don't know how already, right? So basically, for example, me and Carlos, if he wants me to, I don't know, let's say run a marathon, I can't do that yet, right? He would have to build it to get me to engage in that behavior. And it would probably be more effective if he used positive reinforcement, differential reinforcement, shaping and chaining procedures than if he used aversive control, because I'd probably hate him if he tried to make me run 26 miles with only punishment.
But it would work, remember. But we don't want to do that.
So instead of using punishment, we could also be very systematic when we create our programs, right? Well, something we want is maintenance, generalization for appropriate behaviors. Those things aren't just going to happen magically. You have to program for them. So also, you always want to teach functional alternatives, right? So if the behavior that you're teaching doesn't reach the same critical consequence as the inappropriate behavior, it's not going to be likely to last. So it's something to consider.
Mm-hmm.
And the organism might not have other behaviors to engage in. So that's exactly why you need to teach them those alternative behaviors that meet that same consequence. Something else to keep in mind is for most purposes, you always want to try to establish yourself as a reinforcer, right? We learned a lot about conditioned reinforcers when we talked about behavior changing. So if I am constantly being a mean instructor, would you guys be wanting to talk to me, ask for help? Probably not, right? So that's why I always try to make myself into a conditioned reinforcer. So hopefully you guys would feel a little bit more comfortable in approaching me, asking me questions. So ask yourself, are people avoiding me? If they are, I might be presenting a kind of aversive environment. So again, aversive control is everywhere. It's always happened, but it doesn't have to be that way. If we focus on reinforcing positive behaviors, we can be constructive. The world doesn't have to be all ball and chains and whipping people.
Yep.
Cool. So that's it for aversive control. So we will see you in the next video.